Hey folks, it's Nate. Thanks for joining me at the art table again today. If you spend any time around independent creators, sooner or later there's one topic in particular that's going to come up, and that is the number of people who spend their time criticizing pop culture without suggesting any alternatives. It is and always has been a very lucrative field to discuss pop culture. Cao Chuqin, whose name I have undoubtedly butchered, author of Dreams of the Red Room or the Red Chamber, depending on who you ask, was a famous Chinese, in-life painter, but later well known for his novel, who was born wealthy but fell from grace, yet managed to maintain a certain amount of social capital which allowed him to market himself, largely because he could expound very wittily and with great insight on the culture of his day, specifically works of art and poetry. By the same token, George MacDonald, a writer who was very influential on later, better-known fantasy authors such as J.R.R. Tolkien or C.S. Lewis, paid his bills primarily through giving speeches on topics such as Shakespeare, not so much through his writing. In more modern times, of course, newspapers and magazines have long employed people specifically to talk about the culture of the day. Today, podcasts and YouTubes have taken the ability to talk about pulp culture and catapulted it to a very lucrative multi-million-dollar industry. And yet, no matter how large and how easy to break into this industry has gotten, very few people who have done it have been positive. Perhaps the only one I can think of off the top of my head is the previously mentioned George MacDonald, who primarily talked about Shakespeare, a person who it's very easy to be positive about. If you are not confining your discussion to one of the greatest authors your language has ever known, you are bound to encounter far more poor writing than great writing, and that, I think, tends to make you negative. And yet, independent creators, especially today, are always asking why will these people who are so negative about the culture we are getting right now from big-name publishers, from famous authors, from writers and directors past their time, why will they not promote the up-and-coming work, the new things that are fresh, that are interesting, that are exciting? I see this discussion come up at least a couple of times a year on Twitter, on Facebook, on other social media platforms. It is a perennial topic. After all, the attention economy makes it very difficult to get eyeballs on your story. These critics have that attention, and they want to discuss something new and different and interesting. So why not discuss something new and different and interesting? Well, there's a pretty good reason for that. Actually, there's several of them. The first is simple economics. When you make your living discussing pop culture, your financial interest is discussing pop culture. If what you are creating is not a piece of popular culture yet, it isn't going to meet the needs of a pop culture critic. The fact is, pop culture critics do not create much of the attention they use. They actually piggyback on the attention that well-known popular franchises garner from the public. Now, this is not to denigrate what a pop culture critic does. I'm sure it's quite difficult, and I wouldn't want to do it myself. You may notice that I don't spend a lot of time chasing the algorithm on this channel, although I will occasionally do videos on popular topics that I can find an interesting angle to approach. See my Spider-Man videos, for example. But overall, I find that kind of trend chasing to be very draining. And I don't have a whole lot that's interesting to say about these things. I've never gotten very emotionally invested in pop culture content. While I find what Disney has done with Star Wars very disappointing, I would burn out if I tracked all of the drama and poor writing that comes out of Disney on a daily basis. I leave that to other people, and they do a great job of it if that's your cup of tea. But the fact is, if your story doesn't come with that kind of investment already packaged with it, well, pop culture critics aren't going to get anything out of talking about it. Yes, they're tired of talking about bad storytelling. And yes, bad storytelling is more abundant now than in other times. even though bad storytelling has always been the majority of storytelling. But the large pop culture critics are as large as they are, in no small part, because they dance with very big, very popular franchises. There is an art, there is a finesse to dueling with a big company like Disney in and of itself. And many people, like Clownfish TV, like Gary from Nerdrotic, and like Mahler, have gotten very good at that art form. That is what their audiences turn in to see. For the most part, I don't know how much of their audience would be well served by having little-known independent content promoted to them. That's not to say it doesn't happen. I've heard all three of those creators promote independent content. But the fact is, they cannot sell your content until you do. The second reason pop culture critics will not discuss your work is because it may not actually be that different from what's out there, at least in terms of quality. Now, I know. It's very easy to come up with a fresh new idea, a fresh new approach, a fresh new voice in storytelling. The problem is, those fresh new ideas, approaches, and voices need to be really, really refined. They need to be very deliberate. They need to be honed to a level of professionalism and quality that is absolutely ruthless. It is much harder than it appears at first glance to make a story that doesn't suck. Not a good story, just a story that is not actively terrible. And the fact is, if you are a pop culture critic, you spend hundreds and hundreds of hours with stories that are mediocre or poor every year. That is part of the grind that makes these people so cynical when they approach media. If you really want to stand out from the crowd when you approach them, you need to at least have a good product to offer. And you need to make it as easy for them to access as possible. Did you get beta readers? Did you hire a story editor? Did you hire a line editor? Did you shell out for a good cover? Are you offering complimentary review copies? These things are expensive, they are difficult, and they are, frankly, not a lot of fun. They don't have a lot of that spark of creation that really drives most indie guys to go out and make something. But if you want your independent creation to be worth someone's time and money, you really have to put in these extra levels of work if you're going to stand out from the crowd. But beyond that, if you want somebody who typically covers topics that have a built-in fan base of millions of people to pay attention to your work, there better be something there that makes it worth the risk that entails. Your product needs to be good. Finally, you need to understand and respect the creator's audience. Pop culture commentators cultivate specific audiences that are interested in specific subjects from specific points of view. I hate to keep coming back to this guy, but Matt Walsh recently put out a documentary, and whatever you think about that documentary, you have to recognize that it approaches the topic in a very Matt Walsh fashion. It is trolly, it is straight-faced, and yet it is deeply sarcastic. And that is exactly what I would expect of it, because Matt Walsh is all of those things. That is what Matt Walsh's audience has come to expect from him. When he wanders away from those touchstones and engages with something which he is genuinely interested in and cannot treat with quite that degree of irreverence, for example, UFOs, his audience tends to mock him for it, and they are certainly not as interested in that topic as Matt Walsh himself seems to be. Could Matt Walsh have put his efforts towards creating and marketing, say, a new sitcom instead? Yeah, he could have, but I don't think his audience would have bought into it. That's not what he's made his name on. By the same token, pop culture critics are not there to market new stories to their audiences. They are there to commiserate on the successes and failures of stories their audiences already want to engage with. Again, some pop culture commentators do take a little time to promote new stuff that people generally haven't heard of. But they haven't built an audience that is actively looking for new things to talk about. It's important to respect that, because if you can't respect that part of a creator's business, then why should they respect any part of yours? If you're a creator who has a favorite pop culture commentator and you would like to discuss what you've created with them, well, there's no better way to do it than to go through the hard, difficult, boring, and generally very frustrating work of trying to build up an audience of your own. An audience that you can bring to that pop culture commentator and share with them in exchange for their sharing their audience with you. Anyway, that's all I've got for you today. Hopefully you got something out of that. Let me know what you think about commentators and creators sharing audiences down in the comments below. There's a like button and a subscribe button down there. You can use those as you see fit, and I will talk to you later.